Good evening. I am a proud Algerian, and I am a proud African. What does it really mean to be African? To me, to all of you? Is it where we're from, geographically speaking, or where we're based? Is it what we wear, what we eat? Is it the kind of music that we listen to? Is it based on the color of our skin? For each and every one of us, with any link to Africa, identifying with the continent and identifying with our identity will be intimately linked to our own personal experiences. That experience will be very nuanced, very complex, and by no means can we standardize. Today, I want to share with all of you how I perceive my African identity. It's not very easy to do. And I'd like to do it by sharing my personal life story, something which is also not very easy to do. I have had the incredible opportunity to grow up in West Africa as a North African. My parents' jobs meant that every few years we had to move around from country to country, and I had to follow them. I didn't really have a choice. Before I go on, let me check my privilege. I know that my story is unique, and I was born into a life of great opportunities and privilege, which not everybody gets to have. And so everything I'm about to say, I want to caveat it by saying it won't necessarily speak to you or apply. But I do think also that this upbringing that I had gave me a unique and original vantage point on understanding what it really means to be African. So, picture this. Late 90s, early 2000s, a short, skinny, nerdy-looking Algerian kid shows up in Lagos, Nigeria, on his first day of school in Victoria Island. If you can actually believe me, I looked even geekier back then. And I just remember at the time just being desperate to want to fit in to a new environment that I was coming into. Some of you have surely experienced that at that age, secondary school. But when I got into the school, reality hit me really fast and really hard. Reality hits you quick. The Western students in my school never really saw me as one of them. I looked like them. I was white. But I never really fitted in. I could never really fit in. I'd get questions like, how come you don't eat pork? Why does your mom wear a hijab? Does she wear a hijab? And that gap immediately became apparent. We were from two completely different worlds. First obstacle, religion. Then, same school, there were a lot of Arab students and Lebanese students, and I thought, hey, this will be my crowd. And they weren't my crowd. They made fun of me, and they made fun of the way I spoke. Sure, we were Arabs, linked somehow, but my dialect of Arabic from North Africa, Derja as it's called, a language in its own right, was mocked by them because it sounded very different to their way of speaking Arabic. So I couldn't really fit into this Middle Eastern or Arab mold. Second obstacle, language. And then there was this amazing crowd, the majority, the West Africans. Nigerians, Ghanaians, Senegalese, Malians, and of course the ever happy and rambunctious Ivorians. I hope there are no Ivorians in the room. I actually do hope there are Ivorians in the room. This was the crowd I wanted to belong to. They were funny, they were fun, they were genuine, our interests overlapped. I was desperate to be part of the West African crowd at my school. This time, I was accepted. Join, you're one of us. But even then, will you believe me when I tell you, there was still something missing. There was an obstacle, and I was frequently reminded of it. That obstacle was the color of my skin. I wasn't black, and if you're not black, you're not African. The same was true of my summer trips back home to Algeria and to other parts of North Africa. You can imagine after 2, 3, maybe 6 months in Nigeria, I was already starting to walk, talk, and act like a real Naija boy. I'd greet people with "How far now?" "I do." But that was really strange for my childhood friends who had left me to go to Nigeria. All of a sudden, I'd come back as an African, as if they were not African themselves, as if they were Swiss or Saudi or something. You are African. What I'm trying to say through this life story, through this childhood experience, what I experienced there and then, I've continued to face my entire life. This tug between my North African identity, Maghreb identity, and the wider African identity. Everywhere I went, it seemed as though people wanted to define what being African was for me. They didn't see me for who I was or what I wanted to be, but how they perceived me and how they ultimately perceived each other. To this day, in my adult life, in my professional life, fellow Africans come up to me, and every day I get a new label. You're Arab, you're Mediterranean, you're Francophone, you're Muslim, you're Oyibo. That means white in Pidgin. So, what exactly can I do? Well, as a kid, it pushed me to read about my culture. It pushed me to read about my heritage and to read about other people's heritage because I had to relate to them. I had to make myself interesting to them. And this is what I found out, and I want to share it with you today. Apologies if you already know it. The dichotomy, the opposition that is created between a supposedly Arab North Africa and a supposedly black sub-Saharan Africa is a false one. The linkages between us are too great, too deep, for us to simply brush them aside. We are not defined, as far as I see it, by our respective religions, our geographies, language, all of these obstacles I mentioned earlier. What I have found out is that we are defined collectively, North Africa and the rest of the continent, by three things. We are defined by a shared history. We are defined by binding values. We are defined by a common destiny. These sound like lofty words. I promise I'll explain. First, let me say a few things about our common history and our binding values. Our parents' generations and our grandparents' generations, some of you will have realized this already. It may not be news to you. were far more united across borders than our generation is. They had less technology available to them. They weren't as connected. They didn't tweet like us. And yet they were more connected than we are, more united than we are. Why is that the case? Well, for one, they were shaped by a common struggle. And that struggle was anti-colonial resistance. That can unite people. The second thing that united them were these binding values: resistance, solidarity, sacrifice. Those are not empty words, guys. Those unite generations. They unite peoples across borders. They still do today, just not enough. As an example, during the independence and liberation movements in the 1950s and the 1960s, giants of our continent, people like Nelson Mandela, Amilcar Cabral, fought alongside, trained alongside the North African resistance movement in Algeria, the FLN, who were themselves hosted by sister nations, Tunisia, Morocco. The ANC, when it was fighting anti-apartheid, received support from across the continent. From Libya, from Algeria, from Morocco. People poured money into these resistance movements, not because it looked nice or it felt good, because they were brothers and sisters in arms. They were united by a common goal and common values. When I go back to Algeria from time to time, I still hear an older generation that thinks about the 1969 Pan-African Cultural Festival. If you don't know about it, you should definitely look it up. They speak to me of this amazing event with the kind of grandeur that really is very difficult to describe to you here today. Imagine actors, singers, thinkers, philosophers, all rushing to Algiers in 1969, sharing their culture, eating with one another, partying with one another, a kind of Pan-African effervescence that we have yet to see since. So when I hear about all these stories and when I read my own history, as you should read yours, it kind of feels sometimes like we all have a stake, or we all live in this incredible African museum where we have these shared memories, shared thinkers, shared culture, this common history, but each and every one of us decides, well, let me just stick to my section, let me stick to West Africa section, let me stick to East Africa section, let me stick to the North Africa section. Don't do that. Doesn't make sense. All this rich heritage that's at our disposal belongs to all of us. So how can we rekindle that flame? Well, this is what I think. I think we need to reclaim that heritage by re-educating ourselves and re-educating those around us about that history. Read Léopold Sédar Senghor. Read Naguib Mahfouz. Read Katib Yassin. Listen to Salif Keita. Jam to Fela Kuti. They don't belong to anybody. They're not Nigerian, Kenyan, Egyptian, Algerian. They belong to all of us. So if you have that at your disposal, why aren't you making use of it? Why aren't you sharing it? I promise you, if you actually reappropriate this culture, if you haven't already done so, and you don't disseminate it in the way that I would hope we are all doing on an active basis, how can we move forward? So I'm not going to stick to the past. Now I'm going to talk to you about the future. I mentioned shared history. I mentioned binding values. I want to talk to you guys now about the future as well, slightly more difficult. We live in a somewhat troubling time. It has tremendous opportunities for us as Africans. We can make incredible leaps forward. But ultimately, in the 21st century, the challenges that we are all facing are challenges that don't really respect borders. Terrorism, climate change, education, technological improvements, migration. The list goes on and on and on. Do you really think that those problems see the Sahara as a wall? They don't. They cut across borders. They impact all of us. Young people in North Africa have pretty much the same issues that they face as people south of the Sahara. And that's problematic for us. Why? And what can we do about it? It's problematic for us at the moment because we need to understand, certainly I see this way, that as Africans on the global stage in the 21st century, just by being Africans, we are immediately put on the back foot. Immediately. We have to justify ourselves. We have to explain. We have to describe. We have to find a voice. Do you really think that this is something we can do, each one in our corners, trying to fend for a voice? No. Unity matters, and bringing down those walls, those divides that I mentioned, because this is how we will solve collective problems. This is how we will make our voices heard. Every Africa conference I go to, we used to be the hopeless continent. Now we're Africa rising. Those narratives aren't ours. We didn't come up with those. We didn't have a say in those. So if you don't have a voice, a strong voice, a united voice, people will speak up for you. And we find ourselves on the back foot, having to explain, having to justify, having to correct. How do we fix this in practical terms day to day? In addition to what I mentioned earlier, reclaiming that shared heritage, that shared identity, in addition to finding those binding values, you all, and me, need to fight the misconceptions between ourselves and the misperceptions that others might have of us on a daily basis. That means succeed, be the best. I promise you I'm not being a motivational speaker in saying that. But it has its value. If business is your thing, be an entrepreneur. If politics is your thing, get involved. Don't just sit there and complain. If science is your thing, innovate, create. And when people tell you you can't because you are African, challenge that. Challenge the narrative that's presented of you and of your continent. Challenge it intelligently. Challenge it with strong values. The values of resistance that I mentioned earlier, that those who came before us leveraged so eloquently, and which ultimately brought them success. Don't let others define you, define us, the way I was defined as a kid. Make yourselves heard. So when we reclaim that shared heritage, when we've hopefully revived those binding values, and when we've started to reshape the narrative about ourselves, we'll start to make progress. I don't usually like inspirational quotes. I don't like mushy quotes from great thinkers. But I want to leave you with this one because it's a thinker and a quote which has deeply impacted how I see my country, how I see my continent. And this quote comes from the great Afro-Caribbean thinker, Frantz Fanon. Some of you will know who that is. Fanon said, "Every generation must, in relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill that mission, or betray it. I'd like to leave you with the following. Please, let us fulfill our mission of reclaiming our shared heritage, reviving those binding values, and reshaping the narrative for ourselves, but also for those to come. Thank you very much.